Welcome to Truck Tech. I'm Thomas Wasson, and today we're going to be talking about emerging autonomous vehicle regulations. There's been a lot of moves lately in the autonomous space, and so super important to ask some experts and see what the heck is going on and what should we expect for the rest of the year. So without further ado, I'm excited to be welcoming on our guest. It's Adam Raviv. He's the global co-chair of Sidley's Automotive and Mobility Practice, former chief counsel of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration as well. Adam, absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Super excited.
Pleasure to be here, Thomas. Thank you.
So let's talk about your background a little bit. You have a really awesome time being at NHTSA. And so it's super exciting to get to talk about folks who get to see behind the curtain, how everything works. Give us a little bit of your background and talk about some of what you worked on and then what your current role is.
Sure. So I've been a lawyer for a little while now. I spent most of my career in private practice, and then I joined the previous administration on day one of January 20th of 2021. I spent a little while working in the White House. And then after that, I moved on to the Department of Justice. And then after that, I got the very exciting opportunity to move over to NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, to be the chief counsel. NHTSA is one of the operating components of the Department of Transportation. The department is, for the most part, broken up into several operating administrations or components that each deal with a particular mode of travel. And is, in short, you could call it the car mode. It deals with vehicle safety, driving safety, and fuel economy. And while I was there as chief counsel, the agency was very active on rulemaking, on enforcement, on some important policy matters that it was dealing with. And one of those big focuses was autonomous vehicles and understanding what kind of world we are emerging into in that area, how that's going to change the overall landscape of what transportation looks like in America, and how to ensure that we promote innovation while at the same time ensuring safety levels.
And coming from the regulatory aspect, when we're diving into the autonomous trucking regulation, what's fascinating is it does feel like since 2020, things have really escalated in terms of capabilities. We have testings, we have partnerships. Having some experience being under administration, the White House, DOJ, NHTSA, is that something, does it catch folks off guard, or is it kind of like, oh, well, this thing's coming up in the pipe, let's get to work, let's start trying to digest this thing?
So in the agency that I came from, NHTSA, there was a real concerted effort that happened under the administration where I worked, and in many ways is continuing in the current administration, to acknowledge that autonomous vehicles are an exciting new development in the world, and finding ways to, like I said, encourage innovation while still dealing with the questions about safety. I mean, this is a real new technology for a lot of people out there, and that leads to a lot of questions. Is this safe? I, on multiple occasions, both while I was in the government and then since I left, I would get the question, how can you let these vehicles on the road? Who knows what they could possibly do? And that raises a number of policy questions. It also raises and brings to light some legal questions. One thing that I would often need to explain to people, and then I still explain to people, is that there is a overall framework of regulations that apply to motor vehicles in the United States at the federal level. And those regulations, for the most part, apply equally to autonomous vehicles and to vehicles that have human drivers. A lot of these regulations were written with the assumption that a vehicle would always have a human driver. But at the same time, on their face, all of the rules that relate to vehicle equipment, vehicle safety performance, they apply to all types of vehicles. And if a vehicle is fully compliant with all of the federal motor vehicle safety standards that apply to that type of vehicle, in terms of the equipment it has, how effective things like the braking systems are, how the lights work, how dashboard displays work, then the rules are essentially neutral about whether it is a human or a computer that is that is driving the vehicle. There are no particular regulations that an autonomous vehicle has to follow that the rest of the vehicles that have human drivers don't need to follow. And there are a couple of implications of that. And the one basic point to keep in mind is that if a vehicle is manufactured and it comes off the assembly line and out of the factory, and the vehicle has equipment that allow it to comply with all the existing literal rules of the road, then the fact that you may now put a whole bunch of tech onto it, sensors, decision-making algorithms, everything like that, that enables the vehicle to drive without a driver, that does not create any additional regulatory barriers at the federal level before that vehicle is authorized to go on the road. And there are a lot of discussions about whether this is a viable long-term situation to be in, or if there should be specific rules out there that specifically apply to autonomous vehicles. But that is that is where we are now. And that's not to say that federal regulators aren't doing anything on autonomous vehicles. We did plenty while I was at NHTSA, and the new administration has continued to take actions relating to autonomous vehicles in various ways. And in addition, I may be getting a little ahead of our discussion. There's also a lot of action in state and in state and local governments throughout the United States regarding autonomous vehicles. There might be additional permitting requirements or restrictions or testing requirements or other types of regulations that apply to the operation of autonomous vehicles in particular jurisdictions within the U.S.
So kind of to summarize, one thing that has one of the big questions I've had is, why is everyone doing third-party safety cases? Why are we doing independent validation? Because of how the rules are wrote, it's really, there's not a specific word for autonomous. It's just, you need to have within these vehicles these subsystems. And so does that kind of open a situation where it's like your game to lose almost? That's why you see these autonomous redundant safety systems. You see double braking, double compute, ability to run with half your stuff. Is that kind of one of those things where, because it's so open at the moment and not as narrowly defined, is there like a big fear that the first one to screw it up and then NHTSA looks at it saying, oh yeah, I guess we do need to make sure they all need like double brakes, double this, double that?
Yeah. Thomas, that's a very insightful way to look at it. I mean, what you are seeing with a lot of companies is that they are making sure to cross every T and dot every I. Among other things, they make extensive use of safety cases. Now, a safety case is not itself an objective standard. A safety case is really a structured argument about why a particular system is safe. And safety cases are used well beyond the context of autonomous vehicles. A number of different industries and different types of companies that are subject to different types of regulations, both here in the U.S. as well as in other countries, they use safety cases because they are a very useful way to look at a problem, examine a problem, try to think of all the scenarios in which safety problems might arise, and then figure out how to address them. There are, as I'm sure you know, there are international engineering standards that deal with safety cases. Safety cases are also a part of some international, some statutory regimes in other parts of the world. And among other things, safety cases are a big part of a rulemaking proposal that was issued while I was at NHTSA, called AV STEP, which stands for the ADS Equipped Vehicle Safety Testing and Evaluation Program. And I can talk a little bit about AV STEP if you'd like to hear about it.
Yeah. Let's dive in. Give us a quick overview about it, and then we can dive into also some of the states and how it's like the Wild West in terms of who's making the rules and what the advantage is.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So AV STEP is a rulemaking proposal that was issued while I was chief counsel, really just about at the very end of the previous administration. The AV STEP proposed rulemaking was actually published in the final week of the Biden administration. And the proposal was out there. it's up for public comment, as is the normal procedure when you're making a federal rule. And we will see what current administration does with it. Will they go ahead and finalize the proposed program? Will they make modifications in response to their own policy goals, as well as in response to the commentary that came into the proposed rulemaking? Or will they do something else? Or will they do not much on this? We will wait and see what that happens. But AV-STEP was conceived to be a innovative and novel program. And an important thing to keep in mind from the beginning about it is that it would be a voluntary program. Companies, AV operators would apply to participate in the AV-STEP program. If they chose not to apply, or if they even applied and didn't end up becoming participants, that would not mean that they could not put autonomous vehicles on the road. Rather, there would be certain potential advantages to participating in AV-STEP. And one advantage would be possibly a more effective and efficient route toward regulatory exemptions that some autonomous vehicle operators might desire in order to put somewhat more innovative vehicles on the road that, in the company's view, are safe, but that, strictly speaking, don't comply with all the federal motor vehicle safety standards. In particular, maybe they don't comply with certain standards that maybe were not as necessary when the vehicle in question doesn't have a human driver. And also the simple fact that it would be publicly known that a company is participating in the program may get that company some benefits. In exchange for participation in the program, every company that is a participant would be required to submit very extensive data about its operations to NHTSA. And NHTSA could potentially use that data to do its own research, get a much more comprehensive and granular understanding of AV operations, and potentially in the long run, maybe use that data in order to support its own efforts to initiate sort of the next generation of rulemaking with respect to autonomous vehicles. And going back to how a company would potentially participate in AV-STEP, a big part of the application process would be the submission of a extensive safety case by the company that has been validated by an expert third party. And that would be a very significant component in the company's petition for participation in AV-STEP.
And I kind of want to build on that because I'm trying to, for folks who are understanding, it feels almost like the trucks are ready. Some of the OEMs on the hardware side are like, well, I don't know, I'm holding back. But at the same time, so with AV-STEP, I've got a curious example. The FMCSA requires roadside cones. There was a whole thing with Aurora trying to have driverless vehicles not need the cones. And so is that one of the things when we're looking at a regulatory thing, I'm going to submit my safety thing, my third-party validation. If I get into an AV-STEP or whatever the new administration may call it, is that kind of the goal for a lot of these companies, is this like public-private shared thing to help provide the data? That way I get more favorable rulemaking instead of just leaving it up to the government that may not have all the data they can use. And then it's like, well, crap, now I got to like go through this years-long lobbying process to like change the rule, like try to get ahead of the rule so you don't have to change it because it can take so many years.
Yeah. So Thomas, you raise a number of interesting questions, and I'll try to sort through them a little bit. First, you raised FMCSA and some of its regulatory decisions. So a little bit stepping back for people who would like a little bit of a better understanding of how the different regulators interact. So FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, that is another one of the modes of the Department of Transportation, separate from NHTSA. It's sort of you could call it a sister agency to NHTSA. FMCSA is essentially the trucking agency, in the way that NHTSA is kind of the car agency. it's a little bit more complicated than that because NHTSA also does set federal motor vehicle safety standards for heavy trucks as well. But FMCSA does a lot of really important rulemaking and has a lot of important regulations regarding all kinds of trucking operations, including requirements that go beyond strictly what, like, the actual physical vehicle, what kind of equipment and performance it needs to do. And FMCSA deals with things like trucker hours and as you mentioned, how to deal with emergency situations. And that is, I'll be honest, that is, these cross-cutting responsibilities over the trucking industry that multiple agencies have, each one of which has its own rulemaking authority. I mean, that is a continued challenge for policymakers and rulemakers to make sure that everyone is sort of working toward the same goal. And to be a little bit more granular, like, for example, NHTSA does not have the power to exempt a company from a regulation that is an FMCSA regulation. Rather, in the long run, sort of a more coordinated interagency approach would be needed to deal with those kinds of tricky situations where NHTSA is not the only regulator in the room whose actions are relevant to a particular company.
And that kind of reminds me, I guess it's like a three-headed hydra. So let's say a simple thing like a safety cone. NHTSA would say, well, I need to get, maybe it's okay, NHTSA passes for OEMs to allow flashy lights on trucks and trailers. And then Federal Highway Safety is like, okay, well, you're on the roads. I'm going to let you do certain things on the roads, but then to operate your business, I still have to lobby the FMCSA to say, look, NHTSA allows me to have the flashy lights. Now I don't need the cones. And then FMCSA is like, okay, well, I guess you don't need the cones now. So it's almost like a three-headed hydra when we're trying to come up with an AV framework, because you have to tackle the beast of how's the equipment, what are the safety standards on these things in the vehicles for OEMs. But then for the autonomous trucking companies, you still have the regulatory thing to deal with another agency, which trying to get all that in the same thing, it's got to be a challenge.
It absolutely is. And I will tell you, Thomas, so I mentioned that my job at NHTSA was only one of a few different jobs I had in government. One absolute constant that you see when you work in government is that often it's not simply a single agency or a single office that is working on an important policy issue or a particular matter. You have a lot of interagency interactions. You have a lot of cross-cutting issues. This trucking example is just one of many examples, and calling it a three-headed hydra, I have to admit, may even be overly optimistic, because there are other components of government that might be involved in areas like autonomous trucking or autonomous vehicles. I mean, to just give one other example, you have cybersecurity issues, and none of the agencies I mentioned are really privacy agencies, but that could absolutely be implicated in these kinds of cases too. And now in a broader environment where we're dealing with a lot of rapid changes in things like trade policy, importation of different types of equipment from different parts of the world, again, it is a long-term tricky problem. It's certainly something that companies and their representatives want to think about how to effectively advocate and how to advocate for effective coordination to deal with some of these tricky problems.
And I wanted to talk about the state and the local play. That's what also fascinates me, is that as we're working on this AV regulatory framework, which is kind of like the holy grail, if I get this right, I can then hit the gas in terms of deployment and operations. States, California and Texas in particular, I hear it's a battle amongst the states and the state DOTs as well. Is that something where, in your opinion, and this is what I'm trying to wrap my head around, would the states potentially be ahead of the government if they say, well, I'll let you do robo-taxis from Dallas to Houston, or, robo routes? Or how does the states have a play in that? Because it does feel like the trucking companies and the autonomy companies I speak with, they do prefer certain locations for their testing while the federal wheels continue to turn.
Yeah, absolutely, Thomas. And in the absence of clear or really any specific federal standards that apply to autonomous operations, states and local governments have really stepped into the breach, and they've taken varying approaches to autonomous operations, and certainly to autonomous trucking. As we all know, we started to see autonomous trucking commercial operations in Texas, which, for a variety of reasons, has emerged as a fairly attractive first location for these types of operations. And that's a combination, I think, of the regulatory environment. Texas, at least under its current law, has a pretty laissez-faire approach to autonomous vehicles. And in fact, not only has the Texas legislature allowed autonomous operations and essentially said that if a vehicle is complying with federal regulations, then that apply to it, then we're not going to set rules that restrict its ability to operate within our state. The legislature has also prohibited local governments within the state from applying additional restrictions on these vehicles. And then in addition, I think Texas is maybe geographically and climate-wise a fairly relatively easy place for operations to happen, just because it has very long stretches of highway, some of which might not be very congested. You have a relatively hot, dry climate. You're not going to have many iced over roads or maybe much rain. So that's not to say that there are not challenges to operations. There are challenges to operations anywhere. But relatively speaking, I think that's part of why it's happening and starting to happen there. But I think it will start to happen in other places, just like we're starting to see robo-taxis be deployed in various cities.
That's what I was curious. That was our final big topic, was the robo-taxis. And I think it's almost, I explained to people in the autonomous space for trucking, I was like, it's not just the big rigs. It's the small local day cabs, box trucks, the big rigs, the medium rigs. But then we have the car side. And so tell me some of the thoughts about the robo-taxis, because it's been explained to me two different ways. Someone told me it's a little easier because they're not going as far and as fast if they hit a few things, maybe less liability issues. I don't know. It's just what I hear. The other one is that, do you think we'll see a situation where maybe the robo-taxis kind of eventually pave the way? Because it does seem like we're still in this, Wright brothers moment where we haven't really fully developed. We made a plane. We just hadn't really got the rules on how to fly it yet.
Yeah, that could well be the case. Autonomous trucking and robo-taxis, they're different. They both deal with different kinds of challenges. They both clearly have challenges. Right now, robo-taxis are generally operating on local roads within urban areas. So what they don't tend to do is operate at high speeds. And that obviously addresses one of the biggest threats to safety when you have a person in a vehicle, which is that the vehicle is going fast. When vehicles are going less fast, you probably still get crashes. The odds of those crashes turning into a severe situation for the occupants of the vehicle are quite a bit lower when you're going 15 miles an hour instead of 75 miles an hour. At the same time, it is certainly an extremely challenging technical achievement to have a vehicle operate autonomously in a busy local street, even if the vehicle is not moving fast. You have lots and lots of other vehicles that are stopping and starting. You have pedestrians all over the place, not all of which may be fully observing jaywalking statutes, and they do create a real engineering challenge. And it really has been an extraordinary technical accomplishment in recent years that you now have vehicles that navigate these kinds of environments very effectively. Trucking is, in a sense, is almost, at least the way heavy trucks are starting to operate autonomously, is sort of the opposite situation, where they tend to operate on bigger highways where there's a lot less, we hope, start and stop traffic. But the potential for high speeds, raises other potential safety issues. And of course, heavy trucks are different in all kinds of ways from robotaxis. And again, it's a real engineering achievement when a company has successfully deployed an autonomous truck that can drive a couple of 100 miles carrying a load without incident.
I had one last question.
I'll also mention.
Yeah. Say.
Yeah. I'll also mention.
I'm losing my mind here. Here, we'll do a retake. What did you also mention on that? And then I had one last question. I know we're going a little over time, but I wanted to pick your brain.
Yeah, sure. I'll also mention that we talked a little bit about state and local regulation. I mean, when you talk to participants in the industry, or you see what they've written or testimony they've given, the one word you always hear is the word patchwork. You have very different regulatory environments in different parts of the country. And in the long run, that will create difficulties for the mature development of autonomous vehicles and the mature interstate deployment of autonomous vehicles. So the ideal is eventually we do have a broad federal framework that sets uniform rules of the road for vehicles so that they can operate predictably anywhere in the country. And to be able to do that, you have to have a very clear idea of what those national rules should look like.
And final thought as well here, because one of the big things I think is fascinating is the interplay between the auto truck makers and car makers and the technology people who put things on them. And so with being at NHTSA, if there's a really bad accident, is that where NHTSA can investigate? That's my first part of the question. Is there an actual investigation, let's say, if an autonomous truck gets in a really nasty wreck?
Absolutely. I mean, that is one thing, an important function of NHTSA. If there is an incident, it can be a horrible accident, but it might be something, a near miss that people learn about, and that raises questions about whether a particular vehicle is safe. And this is an authority that the agency has and often uses for all kinds of vehicles. By no means is this focus just on is this authority just about autonomous vehicles. So if there is evidence out there that a vehicle has acted in a way that creates questions about either A, whether it complies with federal standards, or B, even if it's fully compliant with federal standards, whether it has a safety defect that poses a risk to safety, then that is absolutely something that NHTSA can investigate and potentially take action involving the company that manufactured the vehicle or the equipment that's given rise to the potential issue.
You've given me the second part of my question, which is I wondered why anything from like OEM makers, brake makers, tier one automotive suppliers are so skittish right now with fully developing and deploying these vehicles, because an absence of a legal framework that may exonerate them. Is there a fear that if you have a bad enough boo-boo and you don't do your homework and make sure you have the best product, that you may inadvertently speed up certain regulations that may not help your cause?
I think you raise a really clear concern that a lot of smart companies and their leadership are really cognizant of, which is that AVs are under a public microscope, not just from regulators, and maybe not even primarily from regulators, but from the public generally, from the press. Frankly, each company is under a microscope of its competitors, who would maybe nothing more than to see something bad happen to a company that they're trying to race to lead the market in. And whenever anything bad happens involving an AV, it just tends to get a lot more attention. You have incidents that go viral, either if there's a crash or even if there's a not crash, but something where you just have a vehicle that looks like it's operating a little funny or a little erratically. And of course, as we all know, vehicles with human drivers do horrible things all the time. And most of the time when that happens, the only people who really pay attention are maybe the immediate family and friends of the people who are in the crash. But when you have an AV, the incident can go viral and it can lead to real regulatory scrutiny. It can lead to very bad press that by itself can potentially cripple a company. Certainly the most responsible companies that are operating in the AV space and that are thinking long term about how to be successful err on the side of being careful. That is always something that I've seen time and again. That companies want to do the right thing, want to make sure that people know they're doing the right thing. They put safety above everything else, and maybe even above what the kind of non-existent federal regulations would strictly apply.
Perfect. Adam, thanks so much for taking a little extra time to talk with me. Let me pick your brain as well. Folks want to learn more about what you're working on. I have Sidley's Automotive and Mobility. What's the best way to get more info, get in touch with you, check out what y'all are working on? Where can folks find out more?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I co-chair the automotive and mobility practice at Sidley Austin, which is a international law firm. We've got offices in a whole bunch of places in the U.S. and elsewhere. I'm based in Washington, D.C., but there is no one anywhere that I would not be very happy to talk to, whether they need help with a regulatory matter, with thinking through what the regulations should look like, if there's an investigation, if there's a litigation. I and my colleagues are always happy to talk about ways we can help you.
Perfect. Adam, really appreciate your time as well. We'll definitely have to catch up again soon.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
That's going to be a wrap for this episode. If you're just joining us, it'll be on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you can find your podcasts. While you're at it, subscribe to the Truck Tech newsletter. It goes out every Friday around 11 a.m. Eastern at freightwaves.com/trucktech. That's a wrap for this episode, but don't worry, folks. I'll see you again next week.